This Be Foodwise webinar series is a space we've created to have deeper, more honest conversations about food, not just what we eat, but where the food comes from, who produces it, who has access to it, and how food is shaped by systems, policies, power, and our everyday choices. So, for over the last 2 years, this series has been our way of widening the lens, especially for the urban audiences, to understand food as something deeply connected to health, livelihoods, equity, the environment, and democracy, and many other factors. Today's conversation asks us to look more closely at how hunger is understood in urban contexts. So, hunger in cities may often be less visible or less easily recognized, and it doesn't always match our familiar images of deprivation. As cities grow and more of us live increasingly disconnected from food production, it becomes important for urban consumers and citizens to reflect on what hunger looks like today, who experiences it, and how food insecurity is shaped not just by income but by policy, design, documentation, gender, migration, and everyday political choices as well. To help us unpack these invisible realities, we're delighted to be in conversation today with Dipa Sinha. Deepa is a development economist and associate professor at the Center for Study of Indian Economy at Azim Premji University. For over the last 2 decades, she has worked at the intersection of food rights, public health, and nutrition, contributing to national debates as well as global policy processes, including her work with the United Nations FAO. She has also been deeply engaged with the Right to Food campaign and brings rare combination of academic rigor and on-the-ground insight. So today's session is designed as a conversation rather than a formal presentation. We'll begin with a set of questions to just frame this discussion and then open it up for your questions and reflections. We really encourage you to engage. This is meant to be a shared space for learning, questioning, thinking together about what hunger looks like in our cities and responsibility and agency that urban audiences might have. So please feel free to use the chat for any pressing comments or questions. And thank you once again for joining us today and being a part of this discussion. I'll now turn it over to our conversation with Deepa. Deepa, thanks for joining us today. And as we get into the discussion of urban hunger, it may be helpful for all of us to first understand what it even is. Does it even exist? And if so, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that urban Indians have about hunger and who it affects?
Thank you. Thank you, Jetali, first for inviting me and for that introduction. I'll dive straight into your questions. Before we get into urban hunger, I think a little bit on what we mean by hunger itself. And that, of course, has also been changing over time. There's one understanding of hunger, which all of us talk about when we say, oh, I'm hungry, which is that you have a grumbling feeling in your stomach, you've not eaten for some time, you're hungry. And that is not the hunger we are talking about when we talk about hunger in this context of food security and nutrition. Globally, now there is an understanding that when we talk about hunger, we're talking about food security. And when you're talking about food security, you're not just talking about, therefore, filling your stomach, but what is the kind of food that one is really saying would meet. If a person has that, we can say that that person is food secure. That would be something which is accessible, affordable, and also quite important that it's culturally appropriate, something that gives you the satisfaction of having food while providing the nutrients that a human being requires to lead an active, healthy life. So it's not just even in terms of policy or general measurement, the understanding of hunger for a very long time, and particularly in post-colonial societies like in India, which had gone through long histories of famine, was bhuka pet nahi sona. So that you're not just starving, but that discourse has definitely shifted over the decades. And globally now we understand, like I said, even if I use the word hunger, what I'm really talking about is food security. And that is where we have to then say how much of that exists in India or doesn't. And one way to sort of measure it, this is therefore, of course, more difficult to measure, but there are multiple ways to look at it. One way to look at it would be to see what nutrition outcomes look like. And so if you measure it as child nutrition outcomes, which is sort of a global practice, if we look at children under 5 and how are they growing, compared to the WHO standards, you see that, and it's quite well known, India has always had very high levels of undernutrition. By the latest National Family Health Survey, which was conducted between 2019 and 21, about 35% of children in India are stunted. And when we think of malnutrition, we tend to think of it as some remote, rural, even in rural, tribal, maybe small communities living in inaccessible areas who are stunted. But if it is 1 in 3 children, obviously it's not the case. It is quite widely prevalent. I think what is even more sort of maybe shocking and definitely surprising is that it's not as if it's much better in urban areas. So if you look at NFHS 5, same data source, and see what is the prevalence of stunting in urban areas, it's 30%. So it's almost 1 in 3 still. So it's 38%, almost 40% in rural areas, and it's 30% in urban areas. And when I'm saying urban, this is all urban. So if we do only urban slums, if we do small towns, or if we look at poorer localities within big cities, then it is the prevalence of undernutrition would be quite comparable to rural areas. Of course, stunting is an outcome of not just the food that children eat, but overall socioeconomic environment, the disease environment, and so on. But food does play a major role there. If we look at other trends, like say BMIs, and there certain contradictions also come out, and the trends are pretty much similar in rural urban, with the levels being slightly lower in urban areas, which is that we see that we have both of this persisting alongside. We have a large proportion of men and women, particularly women, who have a low BMI, which is that they're very thin. But at the same time, the proportion of men and women, and again, particularly women, who are becoming overweight and obese is also increasing. And this even more so in urban areas, not just amongst the rich, across socioeconomic categories. And as we go ahead, if when we talk about food, I think this is an important aspect we need to look at once again, because that also has a lot to do with the kind of food people are consuming. So it is very much related to food. And in some ways, the way we see it now, they're both outcomes of food insecurity in different ways, whether it is undernutrition or this issue of increasing non-communicable diseases because of overweight, obesity prevalence, which very clearly is now being linked to diets. So some of the important other things which we know anecdotally and from working with communities, especially during COVID, is that the dietary diversity is quite poor. And that again is quite prevalent in urban areas as well. And that's why I started off with saying that we talk about food security and food as being what is it that the body requires to remain healthy, active, and also satisfied with food. If we look at any markers of that, then you see huge gaps in rural, of course, but in urban India as well. And to some extent, the determinants in urban areas would be, of course, different from rural. There is this one major difference that food is produced, I mean, is grown, much of the food that we eat in rural areas. But at the same time, we also need to acknowledge that most of the food that is consumed in our country, even in rural areas, is bought from the market. So the proportion of food being consumed from own produce, overall average, is less than 20%, including farmers, everyone. So the market plays a big role. And then the influence of the market is, of course, actually higher in urban areas. So issues of access. So there are some certain things that we assume that food is more accessible in rural areas, incomes are better in urban areas. All of this, when we actually break up and look at what is it that people are eating and what are the factors that go into determining what people are eating and how is that affecting their health, we find that there are many issues of concern in urban areas, which not just us as regular citizens or researchers, but even policymakers are often blind to, because we start off with certain myths about the urban being better and not having similar issues.
Thanks, Deepa, for laying it out so clearly and to help us understand even how it exists in different layers. I wonder if hunger and chronic undernutrition persist even without large-scale famines, and why does that happen, and what events and situations kind of contribute to this?
Like I said, they are obviously persisting without large scale famines in a country like India. Post independence, we've not really had a large famine of that nature. And that's what, say, Amartya Sen also talks about, the role of democracy in preventing something like famines, which are acute, where people die of hunger, which is something with a free media and free elections with its problems. But even what we have would not allow to happen. There would be public outrage. I don't think even the rich would be okay morally, ethically, with having fellow citizens just dying of hunger. Right, so that I think would be unacceptable, and I still have that much faith in humanity. But at the same time, chronic undernutrition also tends to be hidden, so it's not causing death necessarily in an acute form in a short term, but it is something that is affecting life chances in various ways. So, for instance, there are studies which show that in the first 3 years of life, if children don't grow at the speed in which they're expected to grow, then that affects their adult productivity. It is reflected in adult heights. It affects their life expectancy. It affects their susceptibility to infections and so on. So it's something that you see the impact of very slowly. It's not obvious even in a community. So let's take, let's say anywhere, say an urban slum, a slum in Delhi. If the like I said, the average is 30%, but in a slum, the prevalence of stunting might be 50%. So if you line up 10 children who are 10 years old, some of them would be below the height they should be, some would be maybe okay, but you don't visibly see a big difference between them, right? So it seems like things are okay. They might be falling ill often, but you think that that's also all right. Everybody's falling ill. So when it is not something that is affecting very few, when it's not the protruded bellies and that kind of undernutrition which has gone down to a great extent, it also becomes more and more invisible both to the communities affected by it but also to others, because you're not going hungry in the sense that you're empty stomach for very long periods and you look okay. I mean, you're doing your regular day-to-day functions, but it is the underlying way in which it affects that kind of doesn't get seen, and that can persist, and that can persist because of multiple sort of reasons. It doesn't have to be because of any short-term event. Of course, it increased during, say, something like COVID, but broadly you think of, when you think of access to food, like I was saying, what are the ways in which you get food? One way is that you're growing food on your own. That's a very small proportion in our country. Urban, that's anyway not a very big option. So I won't go into issues of farmers and all very much. The other way you get food is that you buy it. How do you buy it? It depends on how much income you have, right? And how much income you have depends on what kind of work you're able to find or what kind of self-employment opportunities you're able to create for yourself. So there we would have to look at what is happening to employment, what's happening to wages, and the trends in that are not entirely what we would like to see, because we do see that over the last now 2, 3 decades, although there is economic growth, it is not translated into jobs. It's not translated into higher incomes equally for everybody. So we see, along with growth, a growing concentration, because of which we still have a large section of the population, including in urban areas, whose incomes have increased compared to their previous generations, but are still not at a level where they can be food secure, where it's enough and they're comfortable to be able to afford everything that there is, that they need. So income is a very big issue, and so we'll have to look at what are the factors that go into determining incomes. Things like migration. Why is it that people migrate from rural areas to urban areas, even if they're not coming for very good quality jobs? Like, why does someone come and become a rickshaw puller in an urban area? Why does someone come and do a construction worker job? So it's not some great upwardly mobile thing which makes you want to leave home. Obviously, things at home are even worse. But then what are the factors that go behind that? And when they come here for a better life, what is the kind of life that they face is another kind of thing that we'll have to look at when we are thinking about urban areas. So, along with livelihoods and wages, which is one big issue, which is an outcome of the kind of economic development that we are seeing broadly, if I had to put it in one line, The other also issue, and again in urban, very relevant because most people buy food in the market, is the price of food as well. So that's another thing, how expensive food is. And when I say food, I'm talking about cereal, pulses, animal protein, milk, vegetables, fruits. Each of them have their prices going up and down in various directions. That's determined by many factors. So it's about how much you're earning and how much you're able to buy with what you are earning, which depends also on how expensive things are. So you look at a combination of all of this and you see that the situation generally, the chronic situation seems to be that incomes are not high enough for people at current prices to be able to afford the diversity in diets that they require. Having said that, I will acknowledge and add that there is, and we can't exactly say what proportion of it is which way, but there is also a component of knowledge and behavior patterns, the sense of knowing, which could be driven by convenience and other factors as well, but that you are spending on food, but you're spending on the wrong food. For example, processed food, ultra processed packaged food. I mean, Maggi is a great example, which you see quite commonly in urban areas. For instance, say in communities in Delhi, where I live, where say domestic workers, women, often that's the most convenient food she can give her children for the price at which it comes. It gets cooked jaldi. An older child can make it themselves. So there are other reasons that go into it, but then you're actually eating, you're filling your stomach with empty calories and creating other issues. You're still undernourished. So there is that whole issue also of junk food, let's call it. Not a very technical term, but something that we can all relate to, which is also not a problem of the rich alone. Right. So it's also food choices and what are the factors that go into determining food choices. Maybe we can talk about that as well. I just want to say that along with the caveat, but that I don't think it's just behavior at an individual level that people are stupid, but there are circumstances which make you eat what you eat, which is not always only to do with income and prices, but also various other factors which make you consume things which you should not be ideally consuming. Just to add another data point, something we've not yet published, but we're currently working on, we've tried to estimate what the cost of a healthy diet would be in India. So we looked at the NIN guidelines, which tell you on an average how much cereal, pulses, vegetables, fruits you should be consuming in a day. And we looked at the current prices and estimated the cost, looking at the consumption expenditure survey data. And we compared that cost of a healthy diet with what is it that people are currently spending on food. And when we do that comparison, we find that in urban areas, again, about 30% of the population cannot afford a healthy diet. So even if they spent what they're currently spending on food, so we're not saying that they spend their entire income on food because there are non-income essentials. So we're saying let's assume that what they're currently spending on food is the max amount they can spend on food. If they spent it correctly, if they knew what to eat, can they buy what they should be eating? 30% still cannot in urban. In all India, it goes up to 40. So it's 47% in rural areas. So there is that issue of being able to afford healthy diets, definitely. But there are also other issues. For the other 70%, obviously, because the proportions of people, say women who are anemic, is more than 50%. The issues of dietary diversity and poor nutrition is beyond that 30%. Right? So for 30%, clearly one can say affordability is the issue. For another 20-30, it could be other issues as well.
Yeah, thanks, Deepa. And it's important to understand this issue of affordance as well. And at the same time, we also have in India specifically, we have these large food safety nets, say from PDS to ICDS and school meals. Then where are the major gaps? Like, for example, in Aadhaar linked systems that keep vulnerable urban households excluded. How does all of this then work?
Right. Yeah. So, like I was saying, there are three ways in which people consume food. One is self-production, second is through market, third is, like you mentioned, quite important, is through the safety net programs, because India does have a old and strong sort of welfare system through which of course, there are many programs which contribute to improving livelihoods and wages, but there are these direct food programs which is actually giving food either uncooked or cooked, where food is going to the households, and these are quite large. Um, and there are a number of issues in this, but first, before I get into the problems, to also acknowledge that they have been quite, let's say, they've not been useless. It's not like they've not made any contributions despite the problem that they had. And again, that is something that the pandemic showed very clearly with the PDS, where you saw that, I mean, we again saw in the field quite clearly that people who had ration cards, and because there was this system already in place, people had ration cards, they were ration dealers, there was a system of supply, immediately extra grain could be given, and we saw many families which would have really gone into starvation had this system not existed, because there was no income, work had closed down, but they managed to get at least the basic cereals through the PDS. There were the issues of exclusions, there were problems for people who did not have ration cards and so on. But as a shock absorber, as a safety net, the PDS has been playing quite a commendable role. And that shows in the popularity of the scheme. One can go into whether this is the best form of delivery or not, what should be given, but broadly, that every government kind of is only expanding it and is supporting it is not just something that we derogatory call a populist measure, but also somewhere an understanding that this is making a difference, and that if it's not there, then people don't protest if it's something that's useless for them. They would, because it is working for them in many ways. So the PDS is in that way, I think, but it is a safety net, like you said. I mean, we can't expect from it to do more than what it is, which is that it is a safety net. The school meals and the Anganwadi meals are also very important because, like I said in the beginning as well, that a lot of undernutrition that sets in early childhood is irreversible. So while of course it's important to have access to food and food security through the life cycle, in terms of nutrition outcomes, this catching them young is very important. It's very difficult to reverse the undernutrition that sets in early childhood. It's almost impossible, and then it has an intergenerational effect because maternal health then affects the child's health and so on. And there again, there are issues of behavior also, in the sense that people often don't practice breastfeeding in the right way or do the appropriate complementary feeding. And the ICDS plays a very important role in addressing this, also by giving what they call supplementary nutrition. The school meal also, it's been long studied, is quite effective in not just providing that one meal to children in school, but addressing various things like attendance in school, learning by addressing classroom hunger and so on. But where are the gaps? One big gap, particularly in these schemes addressed at children, which I think are most critical actually, almost right from the beginning, has been that while they've been there, they've also been sort of neglected and under-resourced. So they've never been given the kind of resources you would expect to give in, again, a growing economy which cares for its children. If I give you the current norms, for example, what we spend in the ICDS as a per day for a child is 8 rupees a day, right? And you are hoping to feed the child 50% at least of the requirements for that child with that 8 rupees. That's almost impossible, even if we take into account economies of scale and so on. What can you really give with 8 rupees? You can't, even if you give one egg a week, 5 rupees is gone there, right? If you give one banana, it's again 5, 6 rupees. In urban areas, prices are higher. There's all of that. So what we are investing in these programs, and I'm just giving you the example of the meal cost. If we get into the investment into the infrastructure, the salaries of the workers who are working there, have we provided for cooking gas and so on, then there's absolutely nothing. So even before I get into Aadhaar and digitization and those problems, I think we must recognize that we have not invested enough in our children, who are the weakest link when it comes to malnutrition. They don't have a voice of their own, and that has never become a political issue. PDS to some extent, yes. Various other schemes which are focused on adults and on livelihoods still do get discussed. These are smaller in terms of budgets, but I think much more significant also where the resources has been a huge gap, and it's not uniform across the country. Some states do better than others and so on, but what is uniform is that it is still not the top priority anywhere. The second, also in the context in which we are speaking, is that most of these schemes have been designed with the village in mind and then just copy pasted into urban areas. And this is a problem not just for these schemes, for most of our development schemes, but here also, then, there are little things that in implementation, actually, sometimes the urban becomes worse. For example, the Anganwadi, the idea was that it was a center in the community. So they came up with norms that for X number of children, you would have one center. But in congested urban areas, finding space like that is difficult. And then you will say that, say, one slum which has 10,000 population can't have one big Anganwadi center. It will have 10 small, tiny Anganwadi centers, and you're going around looking for 10 rooms for rent. It's very bureaucratic, but because the way the schemes are designed, it is so centralized and there's no flexibility, and they were not designed keeping urban areas in mind. Sometimes when you see on the ground, you see that it is these things which are making them completely useless. So again, in Delhi, where I live, a lot of the Anganwadi centers run out of scooter sheds, or it's running out of the house of the Anganwadi worker, which is already a 10 by 10 room, which the entire family is sharing, which will have a 3 by 5 area carved out where children will be, running in and out. So there are all these kind of issues in urban that one thinks of. Like, so every center obviously cannot have a kitchen. So then you have to think of where will this food come from? How will it be prepared? Again, the solution was you can have self-help groups do them. Self-help groups are more prevalent in rural areas, urban areas. Many cities did not have self-help groups also. So a number of issues that come up because you've not designed these programs with the urban in mind. The timings might need to be different depending on where women are working and so on. Now, within all this, what we also now see is digitization was seen as something that would solve many of these implementation problems. But if you look at the logic behind why would you expect an Aadhaar linkage to solve this, then the other, what does Aadhaar do? Aadhaar basically tells you, so for instance, if I am Dipa Sinha, my fingerprints confirm that I'm Dipa Sinha. So the assumption is that the problem in the program is that somebody else is pretending to be me and taking away my food. Now, there is no evidence to show that this is the problem that's affecting midday meals or ICDS. And given the nature of these programs, one, that they're universal. You're not targeting only the poor, you're targeting whoever comes to the government school or the government Anganwadi, with the assumption that usually the very rich don't go to these places, which is quite true. And the other criterion is that you belong to that age group. Now, both of this is not very difficult to prove. You don't really need fingerprints, right? Every child is eligible. So if I'm 8 year old and honestly, I mean, this might seem wrong, but if it's a different 8 year old coming and eating my meal, no harm done is what I would say. Yeah, because it's still an 8 year old and that food is going into their stomach. It's cooked food. It's not food that you are unlike PDS that you can divert the truck away somewhere. It is that khichdi that you're getting there. But in the name of making it easier for people, this is what is introduced. What we are seeing then is that it creates a lot of exclusions. One is it disrupts a system which is not strong enough to take this kind of disruption because it's always been a little fragile. And then you bring in that every child, like for instance in ICDS, since last July, facial recognition is now been mandated. And then they discovered, of course, that how you do facial recognition for these little babies. So then they said, okay, mother's facial recognition has to be done. So there are problems there. Network doesn't work. There are glitches. We don't know the data of how many failures. But what we do know and we're seeing is that sometimes they're spending hours because in the last minute something happens. All of us go through this in the various apps that we use. What is the purpose? Like I said, we don't understand the purpose. But what is the outcome? What it does is then the opportunity cost for people is increasing. So they select themselves out of the system saying, this is just not worth my time that I spend so much time to get this food for my child. And it's always convenient because you can say people are not coming. It's not like we've stopped the program, right? So this whole thing of trying to solve the problem, not where the problem exists, but creating non-existent problems, digitization has mostly been doing that, and there are exclusions. The other thing that digitization is supposed to solve, which is very relevant in urban areas, and I think we should think about it, is the issue of what we call portability. Because a large section of the urban poor are short-term migrants or even long-term migrants whose documents are all from their origin villages, even if they've been living in the city for long. So usually it's more convenient for them to get their PDS or whatever done in their village. And when you're linked to a particular shop, a particular center, then you're not able to take that entitlement where you're living. Now, something like Aadhaar can allows you to bring in portability because now everything is digitized, and so you can be wherever you are and you can still get that entitlement. And I think that is important to think about portability, especially in urban contexts, because proving citizenship, proving residence in urban areas for the poor is still a huge challenge. But a question still remains even there on whether portability requires biometrics, because we see that the failures are more when the biometrics come in. We all have, for now years, have had debit cards and credit cards, which work with a chip, which don't require, your fingerprint or your iris. You could have a lower technology solution which creates fewer exclusions. So that problem is there, but I think the idea of portability is quite powerful, and it's coming in PDS in the form of the One Nation, One Ration. And the uptake is sort of there in big cities like Delhi and Bombay. You now do see many migrants from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar taking their rations. Although there are still big issues to do with exclusions, like I said, because of biometrics. There are also other kind of very typical Indian kind of issues like who pays for, if it's a Bihari migrant in Bombay, then does Maharashtra pay for that person or does Bihar pay for that person? And so how do you integrate systems so that Maharashtra is not paying that one extra 5 kilo rice for a Bihari citizen? These things we spend a lot of time in. And in urban areas, we've always found that this thing of citizenship, therefore, becomes a huge issue in terms of access to entitlements. Because it's not enough for you to prove you're Indian, you have to prove you are a resident of the city you're living in. In a city like Delhi, almost all of us are migrants. But for someone who belongs to a certain class where I lease out a house, have had a rental agreement, have a landline phone, I can always prove how long I've been living here. But someone who's living in a slum in an illegal, I mean, still paying rent, but technically illegal, they have nothing to prove that they are a citizen of the city, and that is a uniquely urban issue. In rural areas, you go to the panchayat and they will certify you belong there. But in urban, who will do that certification? Who really belongs to the city is also a big question and challenge in accessing any of these schemes, be it PDS or school admissions, Anganwadi, all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Deepa. It's quite helpful to understand all these different issues and quite eye-opening also some of the facts that you shared. You've already thrown some light on some of the things that you've observed on ground, but it'll be helpful to understand from your work with the Right to Food campaign and various court-led commissions, like how have you seen hunger intercept with citizenship, rights, dignity, beyond poverty?
Yeah. So, like I've been saying, one is the factors that affect hunger are multiple. But I think in a lot of our work, whether with the Right to Food campaign or the Supreme Court case on right to food that some of us were involved with in different capacities, the general understanding has been, and this draws from the Indian Constitution. It's not that we're just saying it here that uh, and that's why we call it a right to food, right? That it's not an issue of charity. It's not an issue of, oh, these people are hungry, let's give them something. But that as an independent, when we gained independence and as a sovereign country, we made this promise to ourselves that we would not let anyone be hungry, and that would be one of the primary responsibilities of the state that we elect. Uh, and therefore, we think that if there are situations like we see there are, where there are a set of people, however many they are, who are not able to access food security, through their incomes and through the current systems, then it is the responsibility of the state to provide uh, avenues through which they're able to accept them. Because the understanding is that if you have people who are left out of the system, it's not because of some individual fault of theirs, but because the system grew in a way where you did not include many, you could not take them along. So how do you include them? And that therefore it has to be not seen as charity and always come as a right of the citizen, and therefore with dignity attached to it. So what does that mean in the forms in which then programs take? So one, for example, we've therefore always seen provision of employment as part of a food security initiative. It was also part of the right to food case in the Supreme Court. And then Narega came as its own legislation, which has recently been replaced with a new act. But that it was food security, therefore, did not involve only just distributing food, but also creating situations where people, if they're not finding work for whatever reason, that there is no work available, then that as a last resort, that the state creates work. This, of course, was just a rural program, but that was the idea behind the Narega as well, right? That if there is no employment available, people are willing to work. It's not that they want freebies, but there is no work available. So then you create work and create the kind of work which is also creating assets for the community and doing many other things. But that's a way in which people are able to also access all of this food and other essentials with dignity. And when you speak to communities, often you hear that they are not asking for charity, they're asking for work. The slogan was Har Haat Ko Kaam Do, Kaam Ka Pura Daam. So you give us work and you give us the right wage for the work, and then we will take care of ourselves. But when that is not happening, then you, of course, need these safety nets as well. So, one big aspect has been work, and Narega or schemes like that are employment, are again shock absorbers. When we're talking about employment, we also really then finally have to think about what is the kind of economic development that we're having that is not creating enough jobs at a decent wage. I mean, often these days you hear that labor nahi mil raha hai. But always the counter question we ask is how much wage are you offering? So if you want somebody for 100 rupees a day and then you're saying then they're not coming forward, that's, I don't think, again, fair. If you're talking about dignity, if you're talking about some recognition, because there has been that level of upward mobility, and people, you pay a fair wage, there is a lot of labor available in this country, and actually surplus, right? Even below a fair wage. But you can't bring the wage down to an extent which is below a starvation level and expect people to come up and work. So that's not directly related to what we are talking about, but even in our work in the campaign, this is something that throughout we've understood quite clearly, that employment, because that's the main source of livelihood for most people that we are talking about, has to be something that we really need to think about. Similarly, rights of farmers and food producers is something that we really need to consider, even when we are thinking about it from a consumer point of view. Because let's also remember that um, of all farmers in our country, 80% are what we call small and marginal farmers. So it's very, very small pieces of land, which also means that they're net consumers of food. So it's not as if a person is a farmer or household is mainly dependent on farming income, it's not as if they're not buying any food in the market, right? So they are actually net consumers. So we have this sort of unique situation where you have a lot of people, currently over 40% of households still depend on agriculture as their main source of income, but they are buying food. So for their income, food prices need to be high, right? Because that's where they're earning from. For their consumption, food prices need to be low. So obviously, if you leave that to the market, it's not going to manage that. Uh, at some point, we should ideally be out of this situation. We are not currently out of it. This is a problem in across the world. Even in the most advanced countries, agriculture is barely ever a profitable business without state support. The difference, however, is that in the US, 2% of the population are in agriculture. Right? So you can really pamper the 2%, give them huge income transfers, which is what they do. But in India, 45% of the population is in agriculture. you can't support all of them through just direct income transfers. So you have to think of ways of investing in agriculture so that it becomes more profitable. Till that happens, how do you make incomes inputs cheaper? How do you make cheap food available in the market till that happens? That's where the PDS also sort of comes in. This is easier to understand in the rural context because it's the same farmer buying the same food. In an urban context, the main concern is always to keep the prices low. And we don't think about the farmers very much in an urban context because, again, they're not visible. We are only concerned about if our tomato is cheap enough and the onions and what the prices are. But if we start thinking about the prices that we are paying for our food as actually the income going to the farmer, then that brings in a whole different uh, angle to it. And that's another thing we try to look through the campaign. So it's not just through these direct welfare schemes, but it's also your larger agriculture policy and how is that oriented, and how is that then leading to what kind of incomes to food producers as well as what kind of prices consumers are facing. So it's not just about, so you said not just poverty, and just expanding that to say it's not just welfare. It is actually broader economic policy with the kind of an equity lens where you're looking at the what we call the food system. So it's not A scheme, B scheme. But if you say from farm to plate, there are many things then that come in: storage, transport, all the middlemen, all their incomes. So what is the policy? One big gap we've seen there is also this lack of a nutrition lens to the way all this happens. Because and what I mean by that is that, going back to where I began again, that if food is reduced to rice and wheat, then you have a certain kind of policy. But if you say food is what you require for nutrition, then actually then your policy should not stop at rice and wheat, right? You have to think of who's growing the vegetables, how are those vegetables reaching the consumer, who's growing the fruits, who's doing the milk, all of that. And there we have huge gaps. Uh, just so that's one whole, the production system, how you look at it. One further point, sort of moving to a different point, if I can add, because you also asked about, I mean, you mentioned dignity and citizenship and so on, which again, I think for an urban audience is something. So while it is true that we have inequality and many of these schemes should address the poor, we find that universalism as a principle is very powerful in the way these schemes are defined. One way, for example, Narega was a universal, continues to be a universal scheme, and that's deliberate. That was our demand. And saying that you design the scheme in a way that there is some self-selection in it. So Narega is hard physical labor. Somebody who doesn't need it will not do it. But the problem with targeting and marking people as saying you are poor and therefore we will help you, you are not poor and therefore we will not help you. One is, in practical consideration, uh, you end up missing a lot of actually poor people. There's a lot of movement also that happens for a huge section who are in and out of poverty. They get missed out, even if the identification is kind of good. But also you're creating that divide, right? Even in a village, you're saying this is APL, this is BPL. So you're kind of dividing the community now along this kind of a line. And then when you say transparency, someone will come up with the idea of at every house just mark if it's a BPL household or an APL household. So these are also not things. If you think of dignity, then some of this would not be acceptable. Just one more example, again, from the point of view of dignity, for a long time we've been demanding, and now you see it in many cities, is that urban areas actually what is required is also what we've been calling community kitchens. Like Brazil is quite pioneering in this, that they have these huge canteens which will sell food at very reasonable rates, which is healthy food. So that again, you're not, if you're a laborer, your only choice is not a chole kulcha or a samosa, but that you actually have a thali which has not puri sabzi but rice dal sabzi, which is not potato, and maybe salad, maybe a chas or something. But that is affordable. It's coming at the same cost of your chole kulcha. Now, so those kind of schemes also, Tamil Nadu started it. Now many cities has it. Should those be open to everyone, or should those be open only to the poor? Like, do you have to go show your BPL card to get that 50 rupees thali or whatever? So this again we saw in Brazil, and what from our work also we thought that it should be universal, because only then it's not like a soup kitchen that you're going and that it's charity. You're going and you're buying food, and where you're eating, there might be next to you a lawyer, a salaried employee, a construction worker, or eating in the same place, and that kind of thing is also important. And again, in Chennai, we saw that it's still accessed mostly by the poor daily laborers, but also by people from other kind of jobs, single men who are migrants, who are also eating there, which keeps the quality up as well. Again, Amartya Sen had this famous line that services which are meant only for the poor end up being poor services. And this we see across. So there are universalism brings in dignity, it brings in the idea of citizenship, that it brings in the idea of solidarity and fraternity, that we are all accessing this scheme. And it is not something which is only for the voiceless. If it is the middle class is also using it, then automatically the quality also becomes slightly better. So these are some of the principles that emerged out of our work while we were looking at the right to food and how what could be responses to hunger and malnutrition.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack, Deepa. Thank you so much. And especially thanks for highlighting the Narega scheme. I think it's helpful to see those interconnections between economics, dignity, work, and food and hunger, all of that. I think it's very helpful how you also laid it out. Now, if you already given the example of Brazil, and we looking at zooming out a little bit from India, what can we learn from other countries? Like, for example, what parallels can be drawn between some global hunger crises such as Gaza or Sudan, and the everyday political and policy choices that may shape food insecurity in Indian cities?
I think, yeah. So first thing, picking up from your question itself, I think the first thing to acknowledge is to acknowledge that the what shapes food insecurity is very much policy and political, right? That it is not individual choices or behaviors or competencies. That it is really larger and increasingly so global policies and global politics, which is affecting local food. So the recent Gaza crisis, for instance, was a food crisis. I mean, you saw children dying of starvation. It was war, but what was the impact of war is that they depended on a lot of imports coming in, which could not come in, and so food was not available, right? And this you see every time there is war, that access to food also reduces, and even if you have the money to buy food, there is no food. Also, trade rules. So again, in India, we think of food a little wider. Say when the Ukraine war began, oil prices in India went up. Why? Because Ukraine is one of the biggest producers of sunflower in the world. India depends on oil imports. 60% of our edible oil consumption comes from outside. Was that always the case? No. Till the late 80s, India was self-sufficient in oil. It was because of WTO and trade rules and various things that our oil production reduced, and various mistakes in our own food policy, agriculture policy as well, because of which we are now dependent on imports for oil. Pulses, which is the main source of protein in Indian diets, also we don't produce enough that the Indian population requires. So one thing that you see is this food sovereignty, that keeping food production within the country of basic staples is still quite important, because you see when incidents like this happen, then we are also affected because the prices are not in our control. They're not in our control of our policy. Right? So if there is some climate change issue somewhere in some part of the world, pulses are produced in very few countries across the world. So somewhere something goes wrong, our pulse prices are affected. There's a war somewhere, our oil prices are affected. So these are kind of things that one has to think about on how do you protect food sovereignty, basically. So that doesn't mean that we have to produce blueberries and avocados. We can do without them. You can import them. Those are can afford imported avocado, can eat them. But things like rice, pulses, oils, which are native to India, which we were producing, which are contribute to essential nutrients in the diet, one needs to think about how they can be locally produced. In actually, we are also part of this global right to food network, and even our the members of the network who were in Gaza in the middle of this war were thinking about how they should have protected some of their food systems, then it would have been better. But because they were totally, that was destroyed and they were entirely dependent on food coming from outside, they were totally helpless, saying, we don't know what we can do, and that this is something that everybody must really think about. And now, even in the context of climate change, this has become something that's quite important. We've not had the chance to think about, this whole idea of food miles, even what we're eating. Because there's a lot of discussion on how diets also contribute to climate change. I think the most critical in that, again, is the issue of decentralized food systems. I mean, it might seem like I'm making this very big leap in making this link, but actually, if you, I mean, at some point we can discuss in greater detail also. When we think about the major food crises that we see in different parts of the country, world, either be in terms of availability or in terms of price volatility, uh, one kind of grand solution is to go back to decentralized sort of food system. So as far as possible to have food happening near where you live, even if not saying everybody has to cultivate. So in urban areas that would still be difficult. In where is the space and all that. So I'm not saying that, but maybe from your state, from your district, that it doesn't come from very far away, and that then you think about diets in that manner. What can be grown here? What can be eaten here? And that in the West is sort of moving, at least wants to. That's the fad. We have still not become as corporatized in our agriculture that we cannot do it. So I think we are actually at the right place to not go the Western direction and then try to reverse. But from now itself, if we think of how can we have a secure food system, that would look, what would that look like? In my opinion, it would look very decentralized and diversified. So how would you think of that? Is something that all of these global crises are teaching us, that if everything is very centralized and dependent on a few corporations, that's risky. uh, so that's a much, of course, bigger issue. But generally, if you look at global patterns, particularly then with food, although there is the whole other, I mean, you have these futures markets, food is becoming more and more of a commodity, which is globalized, right? I think that's where the insecurity is also coming from. So it's the more local it is, and what is the kind of policy that would help, that is something we'll have to. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite helpful to already, through this conversation, start having an understanding of how even we create a food system that is secure, like maybe decentralization, as you said. But when we look at it from like an urban audience perspective or from an individual perspective who wants to be a part of the solution, what forms of awareness, advocacy, or behavioral change could genuinely help address food insecurity, in urban spaces and also beyond charity, maybe.
Right. If I can take that question at two levels, the first I would say just forget about the less fortunate, the poor who are our neighbors, but even our own food consumption. How can we think about it better to be more, let's say, ethical consumers? Yeah. So how much do we know about where the food we are eating comes from? What is the kind of prices? I mean, I know it's difficult. It's difficult to know whether it's organic or not, and how much the farmer's getting, how much the middlemen are getting. That's already, I can see there's a question saying most food is not labeled. How do we know? But even simple things like, now when you go to buy, say, an amrud, you have that amrud with that thermocol covering, which all look the same and don't taste. And you have an amrud which are of different sizes and different levels of ripeness, which have a better taste. That choice we can make, right? That we will not buy the Thai amrud, we'll buy this amrud. We can do what we can do. Or the tomatoes. Clearly, you have one which is definitely coming from a different kind of production than the other. Or the milk or the eggs and as far as we can afford. I mean, I do think affordability is a serious concern, and you cannot therefore preach saying everybody must eat labeled organic food. And that also then goes against what I'm saying, that food systems should be diverse and decentralized and so on. It's also in what we are eating. So And the market plays a huge role in this. For example, we know that a lot of nutritionists in our country now recommend quinoa. Quinoa is not, don't we have a quinoa equivalent grain in this country? No, there are so many varieties of millets. It is true, it's been out of the market for long. We might not know how to cook it, but if we can learn how to cook quinoa, we can learn how to cook kodo also. So to see, so just to be more conscious about what we are eating, to know where it's like, where does this belong? How far is it coming from? Where are we buying it? Are we buying it always? It's difficult. I'm not saying it's easy because convenience is a big factor. And I don't want to sound preachy. It's not easy to say don't eat junk, eat local, and eat so on. But I think still, especially for also younger generations, to just be conscious of what are we eating, where is it coming from. Food waste, for instance, is a big issue, and also what are the uh, food aspirations we are setting. I think that is another sort of responsibility that the middle class should take, which is that we also, I mean, we have access to doctors, we have access to gyms, we have access to 15 other things. And so if you are walking out with a protein bar, we also have to, I think, somewhere remember that we are making that the norm, right? For somebody watching us saying, okay, this is what upward mobility means, that I'm able to have this bar. So I think just being more responsible, that there are demonstration effects for what we are doing. Um, and that just overall, I said the second level, even I think even more than charity, I don't know how to put this, the other big problem in our country where I've been saying that these are not policy priorities. They're not policy priorities also because of the inequality and because we have a huge influential English speaking middle class who is caring about these things less and less. So if we, and it's, of course, one person cannot make the change, but for instance, I've been working on these things now for over 20 years. And over the years, say journalists we work with are increasingly now saying that these things don't interest the young people. These things don't interest people who buy our newspapers or watch our channels. 20 years back, we were able to work with journalists who were willing to do a series on hunger. Today, they're not because they're saying this doesn't sell. Nobody's interested. So I don't have clear answers. But being interested in not just what we're eating, who we are sharing our cities with, who we are sharing our space with, what is the kind of living conditions that they are in, and trying to look at this without uh, preconceived notions and judgments about poor people and their choices, I think would really be the first choice. I mean, even working on these issues, living here, COVID was a huge eye opener for some of us because we went into areas that we hadn't gone into earlier, which is like barely a kilometer away from where one lives. You can see another India, right? And in before saying, oh, but they also have a smartphone and they are also eating burgers, to actually try and understand their economics and what is making the choices that they're making and how are we, without knowing unconsciously, influencing the norms of what is acceptable, what is seen as good food, and so on. I know it sounds all very vague, but that all of us have a responsibility to be responsible citizens, I think. And also somewhere understand that the goal of equity is something that is good for the rich also. I mean, equity is something that only the poor don't have to be concerned about, that it makes for a better society, less inequality overall. And inequality and food insecurity are quite closely linked. So it's and the way the economy is, it's very much led by what the consumer demands. So at least that little bit all of us can do on shifting the demand, being willing to pay that 1 rupee extra for something which is more ethical than something else within our means. But within our means also, we sometimes don't make the best choices. So how much of that can we do? I don't want to sound preachy because this is it's not easy. The main thing I would say is just read the newspaper, be willing to learn about the other half.
Yeah. It's very important that you highlighted this, Deepa, that the younger generation doesn't want to know about hunger. It just feels like how ignorant also maybe we are becoming. But it's important that you highlight all these other things that we could be also doing So yeah, I think overall, uh, it's these steps are really helpful to like just be aware of what we are doing and be more careful than what we are actually right now in making those decisions. So thank you so much, Deepa, for sharing all of these things with us and sharing from your research and from your experiences.